In 2020, Australia tried pretending everything was normal. The country had spent the last year being ravaged by one of the most severe bushfire seasons it had ever experienced. The overwhelming scientific consensus laid the blame for that severity on man-made climate change. Yet, this fact was seldom brought up in news reporting, corporate marketing, or government responses. Instead, what you'll notice was that these reactions acknowledged the suffering, the destruction, the deaths, but not the reason all this happened. In a way, these images were more insidious than overt denial because they were more effective, unintentional propaganda tools. These responses served to manufacture consent for the idea that the severity of the bushfires were a problem separate from man-made political policy, and that just so happened to be a helpful public mindset for a government who had no interest in addressing the core problem anyway. These images, intentionally or not, had the effect of presenting the severity of the fires like it was just a fact of life that one had to get comfortable with. Like it was normal. Anyway, Umurangi Generation is a game about taking cool photos and hanging out with your friends. The music is bumping, the vibes are chill, and there's an anthropomorphic penguin dude. Just, yeah, see those little, blue bottle jellyfish? Just ignore them. Yeah, don't worry about the fact that they're all over the place. Just pretend they're not there. And definitely don't take any photos of them. Don't worry, everything is normal. At first glance, Umurangi Generation appears to be the world's most relaxed photography game. There's no real timer, none of the objects you need to photograph are fleeting or found through convoluted means, and you can take photos horrifically out of focus. As long as the thing falls within the plastic boundaries of your DSLR's viewfinder, it counts. Umurangi Generation takes place in a fictional jet-set radioed future Tauranga, New Zealand. You play as a local Maori teenager working for a media outlet called the Tauranga Express. In each level, you are given a set of bounties to take photos of, like 2 boomboxes or the word mix. But Umurangi Generation is much less interested in the what of the thing you're photographing compared to the how. The game's designer, Naftali Faulkner, did not want the game to override the player's idea of what makes a good photo. While it does grade you on 3 things, color, content, and composition, we're not really dealing with an A to F kind of situation. What is that? Because color is one of the things you're graded on, you'd think a muted or monotone photo would be a ding against you, right? But it isn't. Instead, the game refers to it as a moody photo. Color, content, and composition are not sliding metrics that the game has attached a value to, but rather a ring that all possible variations of photos fit into. In that other photography game, which I tried so hard not to bring it up during this video because every single review of Umurangi Generation can't help but compare the game. You're graded on things like poses, how close the subject is to the center of the frame, and how nice the background looks. A natural consequence of that design choice is objectifying what is a subjective medium. The game presents a set of criteria that it states makes up a good photo, which, you know, might differ from your own opinions. Ultimately, the photos you take are creatively hamstrung by what the game thinks a good photo is. What's cool about Umurangi Generation's relaxed design is that the only real criteria you have to hit is what you think makes a good photo. What is that? On the game's first level, one of the bounties you're tasked with is taking a photo of 7 birds. There are birds scattered all over this rooftop, and during your first run, the only lens you'll have access to isn't wide enough to get them all in frame easily. You're left with no real obvious direction on how you should go about taking this photo. There's no yellow paint or annoying guy in the chair character to guide you toward the quote-unquote correct solution. Instead, you're left with the limitations of your own creativity. It's up to you to navigate this level, mess with composition, and modify your positioning until you're able to fit all the birds in frame. And this isn't the only way to take the photo. I'd wager that you can gather 10 Umurangi Generation players and find 10 different ways they got this bounty. It's kind of like a photography immersive sim. Umurangi Generation is the Deus Ex of photography games. As the game goes on, you'll be tasked with photographing more complicated combinations of items, and sometimes you'll be restricted to a specific lens, which does make some things considerably more challenging. It's a lot harder to grab a photo of the word gamer 7 times when you're restricted to the narrow view of a telephoto lens. What the fuck? You unlock more lenses and post-production effects like exposure and contrast as the game goes on, but these are, for the most part, here to help you express your own creativity rather than added elements that you must use to take increasingly complicated compositions. Even as the game adds more tools to your arsenal, it never loses sight of its initial design goal of player over designer creative agency. Overall, these design choices go on to create a very loose, relaxed atmosphere, aided by the game's music, which was done by a better YouTuber than I, Thor High Heels. It almost feels more like hanging out with your friends than playing a video game, and fittingly enough, you do have a group of in-game friends that follow you from level to level and just kinda dance and vibe the entire time. Yep, so it's just good vibes and chillin' overall. Okay, what the actual hell is going on here? You may have noticed some things don't seem quite right in Umurangi Generation's Taranga. In the tangential space around the things the game wants you to photograph, you'll start to notice stuff. In the game's first level, titled Moau View, one of your bounties is to snap a photo of the titular mountain, which, by the way, is a real thing that has cultural significance to the Maori people that the game even explains. Neat. Obviously, the mountain isn't on the rooftop, so you start to look out toward the horizon and... the ocean and sky are red, and there's a giant UN seawall erected around the boundaries of the city because the ocean floor has risen above ground level. In the Strand, one of the things you need to photograph is the word gamer 7 times. As you scan the wall and manipulate your positioning to get the right angle, you'll see signs for things like the UN repair program and government notices that Taranga is an active combat zone. Caddy Caddy, the game's third level, tasks you with taking a photo of the word cops. When you find it, you realize the phrase is part of a larger piece of graffiti that reads "cops are dirty," and then right below that, a sign that reads "tired of all the noise? Have you considered soundproofing your home?" The game doesn't spell it out quite yet, but there is something bad going on. There are armed UN soldiers, the city seems to be falling apart, and the fact that I'm not allowed to photograph these jellyfish elicits a creeping, banal unease that led me to believe there's more going on here than the game lets on. But interestingly, Umurangi Generation itself never asks you to directly engage with that darker side. The bounties the game assigns you are almost always relatively typical things you'd expect to see in any urban environment. It's in the quest for those things that you start to notice the other stuff. The loose, casual aspects of its photography gameplay naturally lend itself to close examination of background elements one might normally ignore in another game. This is the real magic trick behind Umurangi Generation's acclaim. The contrast between the casualness of its gameplay and the implicit horror of its narrative is how the game derives meaning. Something horrible is going on, yet everything feels so normal. Teenagers dance right next to armed UN soldiers, an advertisement for off-world housing hangs next to movie posters, and the game itself is just asking you to photograph like a cat or something. It's as if your friends, the soldiers, and even the game as a metaphysical object don't realize that anything abnormal is going on, which then makes that implied horror all the more unsettling and personal for the player. Then you get to a level simply titled Contact. You're on a rooftop and the UN soldiers are engaging in active combat with something. If you climb to the top, snap a photo, and raise the exposure, yeah, that's a kaiju. It's a kaiju invasion. More importantly, it's a kaiju invasion that humanity is very much succumbing to. What Umurangi Generation makes abundantly clear is that this is not a war. It's the end of the world. The next few levels reveal that cities have already been destroyed, the UN army is more occupier than liberator for the Maori, and humanity's best weapon, a group of Evangelion mechs that somehow look more ominous than the kaiju itself, ultimately are ineffective. The apocalypse happens, and the game's final level takes place in the shadow of it. Spirits of the Maori watch over humanity's third act, and you're tasked with taking one final photo. And then the game ends. Alright, you may be wondering why I'm breezing past the kaiju so quickly. Aren't they the thing? Isn't this what the game is about? A horrific cosmic force of nature that humanity has no control over? A Lovecraftian product of an indifferent universe sent to inflict pain just because? A threat we have no hope of understanding, let alone stopping? Yeah, most other media featuring giant monsters or cosmic forces usually go that route. But Umurangi Generation does something much more interesting. On the game's second level, the first thing you'll notice is a makeshift UN checkpoint. Right next to it, written in black marker, is a little phrase that envelopes the game's entire political philosophy. We could have stopped this. This is what Umurangi Generation is actually about. 2016 Shin Godzilla could functionally serve as a prequel to Umurangi Generation. The film is about a version of Godzilla that's closer to his original incarnation, a direct consequence of humanity's dabbling in nuclear weaponry. But it's not Godzilla that's the villain of this film. The movie begins with an underwater explosion in Tokyo Bay. Various members of the Japanese government convene with the Prime Minister as they go into crisis management mode. Instead of solving the problem, most officials get caught up in the potential political and economic repercussions of whatever solution they present as a possibility, with some even arguing that they shouldn't do anything about it at all. The one guy who suggests an aquatic creature may be the cause of the explosion is shunned, his concerns dismissed not because of their fancifulness, but because of their political implications. And then a giant tail jets out of the bay. The government members get caught up on the potential political and economic repercussions of whatever they present as a possible solution, with some denying that the tail is even real. But then the animal emerges from the sea and begins destroying docks and boats and part of the city that border the coastline. So the government gets caught up on the potential political and economic repercussions of whatever they present as a possible solution. They latch on to the idea that the creature will crush itself under its own weight should it ever come ashore, ignoring scientific experts who argue to the contrary. The Prime Minister gets on national television to assure the citizens of Japan that the creature will die the second it steps on land, and then it steps on land and starts destroying everything. Government then gets caught up on the potential political and economic repercussions. Yeah, you get the point. The true villain of Shin Godzilla is a feckless, inefficient government that fails to act at every turn until the problem is almost unstoppable. The true villain is the idea that Faulkner has been open about the influence Shin Godzilla had on Umurangi Generation, but despite their overt similarities, the film was not the main inspiration behind the game.
When these bushfires were happening, there was a lot of, discourse and advertising that talked around the issue of climate change quite heavily. They didn't want to directly say that what was happening was a result of climate change. It was, we've always had bad weather, but we'll get through this one. Or, we need to be connected more than ever right now, so buy 25 gigs extra of data a month.
It wasn't just the bushfires that inspired Umurangi Generation. It was the response. It was the skirting around the issue of climate change, the ignoring of the actual cause of the bushfires, and the false sense of normalcy that was presented during and after them. You want to know why you can't photograph the blue bottle jellyfish, but you can photograph death, UN abuse, and the literal end of the world? Well, this is the message you get when you photograph the jellyfish. And then remember that kaiju, the one hidden in the shadows that we had to bump the exposure to see? When you take a photo of it, you're not allowed to photograph the blue bottle jellyfish because they are the reason the kaiju invasion happened. The parallels between the jellyfish and climate change are not subtle, but they are powerful. The game doesn't want you to photograph the jellyfish for the same reason these symbols can't acknowledge climate change. Because Umurangi Generation is a critique of the economic, political, and social contradictions we live under, and how those contradictions are unable to resolve themselves, even in the face of disaster. Importantly, the game is specific in what aspects of those contradictions it is critiquing. What separates Umurangi Generation from a lot of its contemporary cyberpunk counterparts is that the game has a coherent worldview. In that aspect, it has much more in common with the works of someone like Ursula K. Le Guin than Cyberpunk 2077, because Umurangi Generation points the finger at a very specific ideology: neoliberalism. Here's a quote from Faulkner himself. With neoliberalism, it's about making you comfortable in the face of something that's a really big problem. With the idea of the game, there's this thing, the giant kaiju, that if you look really closely isn't the first attack that's happened. This society that you're in has tried to massage and comfort the idea of this being something that you could probably just have to get used to. Why neoliberalism? Well, beyond the fact that it's the dominant ideology of the quote-unquote West, including Australia, it's marked by some contradictions that place it in a particularly tough spot at addressing something like climate change. See, man-made climate change has largely been exacerbated by things like free market excesses and a lack of corporate regulations. A couple things neoliberalism just happens to be, like defined by. So, how do you address an existential disaster caused and worsened by some of the things that are foundational to the ideology that governs most of the world? Well, you really can't. Not without some serious political and economic reform that would go directly against the political beliefs of a few superpowers and the economic interests of a few billion-dollar industries. There were attempts to ignore it outright, to debate whether or not it even exists, but we've hit a point in our current era of late-stage neoliberal capitalism where some of the repercussions of man-made climate change have become unavoidable in our daily lives. So what's happened now is that instead of addressing the core problem, because remember, it can't address the core problem, neoliberalism has incorporated the symptoms of climate change into a framework that makes sense within the logic of markets. The ocean floor is rising? Don't worry, there's a company that will build a seawall around the city. Worried about carbon emissions from certain products and industries? There's a market alternative. We need to invest in sustainable energy. Don't worry, the banks are on it. Just ignore the fact that they're still giving 10 times that amount to all these other industries. This creates a sort of public pacification. Addressing the symptoms gives the perception that something is being done, while in reality the problem continues to fester. The aim is to make you feel comfortable despite that. In a word, it makes everything feel normal. In his seminal work, Capitalist Realism, cultural critic Mark Fisher spoke about this directly. Climate change and the threat of resource depletion are not being repressed so much as incorporated into advertising and marketing. Yet, climate catastrophe features in late capitalist culture only as a kind of simulacra, its real implications for capitalism too traumatic to be assimilated into the system. And now's a good time to talk about capitalist realism more generally. It's a really good complementary work to understanding the underlying political philosophy behind Umurangi Generation. And if you need some convincing of that, let's just take a look at how the book opens. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Capitalist realism is defined by Fisher as the widespread sense that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economic system, but also that it is now impossible even to imagine a coherent alternative. Capitalist realism is essentially the naturalization of capitalism, transforming it from a man-made economic structure to a fact of nature. Under this framework, capitalism is not a set of political and economic policies. It's not the privatization of the means of production. It's not even an ideology. It just is. It's normal. An ideological position can never be really successful until it is naturalized, and it cannot be naturalized while it is still thought of as a value rather than a fact. It is through this lens that we can see how images like this Domino's poster can serve an ideological purpose without being conscious propaganda. No, I don't think Domino's marketing team were literally in back rooms figuring out how they could run cover for climate change. The same way I don't think you as the player are consciously serving as an agent of neoliberal propaganda by avoiding photos of the jellyfish. But despite that, there is an element of media manipulation in both examples. The idea of capitalist realism has become so ingrained and so normalized that it will reinforce itself without any conscious effort from people or institutions. It's not exclusive to news media or advertising either. As Fisher writes, it is more like a pervasive atmosphere, conditioning not only the production of culture, but also the regulation of work and education, and acting as a kind of invisible barrier constraining thought and action. It's not hard to see how this plays out in both the real world and in Umurangi Generation. Both of them got movies that will incorporate aspects of their respective catastrophes into apolitical disaster slop, opportunistic companies that will use the disaster to sell product, and free market solutions that aren't really solutions at all, just band-aids over a festering wound. The game takes Fisher's ideas to a heightened but logical conclusion. Even in the face of the apocalypse, capitalism will reinforce and normalize itself rather than address a problem that would undermine it. But Umurangi Generation doesn't stop at just showing us what capitalist realism looks like during the end of the world. I think the game uses that political philosophy as a groundwork for exploring the contradicting feelings living in such a twisted reality elicits. The systems around the player may try to project this image of normalcy, but when the view outside your train car looks like this, you can't really square that circle. For the player, the end result is a sort of existential malaise in the face of the contradictions between the normalcy that is being presented to you and the feeling inside of you telling you all this stuff is wrong. And, that's a feeling that I'm becoming increasingly familiar with in my day-to-day life. And there's actually a word for it. Hypernormalization. It's the juxtaposition of the dysfunctional and mundane. While capitalist realism captures the underlying political philosophy in Umurangi Generation, the concept of hypernormalization fits closer to what playing the game actually feels like. Because in my reading, the game uses the contradictions between its gameplay and its narrative to inflict that feeling on the player. You know that weird feeling you get when you're playing Skyrim and the game glitches out in some horrific way, but everyone in the game is acting like it's all normal? That's what playing Umurangi Generation feels like. During the first few hours of the game, it really downplays the whole apocalypse angle. Its Steam page only vaguely references an impending crisis and mostly focuses on the photography. Likewise, the first few levels you'll undoubtedly feel something is off by the seawall and the presence of the UN, but the extent of it, the existential atmosphere you'd think would be pervasive days before the end of the world, is not there. And there isn't a single line of dialogue, a cutscene, or opening crawl that sets the context in which the game takes place. You're just dropped in this world, left to figure it out on your own. Outside of the game's optional tutorial, it doesn't even explain the rule about the jellyfish. You'd only find out about it if you happen to take a photo of them. And even then, the game doesn't explain at all why you're not allowed to. So, all the narrative exposition, all the stuff about the world Umurangi Generation takes place in that I've talked about in this video is completely done through environmental storytelling. But even so, the way the environmental exposition is delivered is done very differently from something like bioshock. And that delivery is done to convey the feeling of hypernormalization. Don't get me wrong, I'm not here to throw shade on BioShock's environmental storytelling. It's one of my favorite games of all time. But despite both games taking place in a dystopia created by the excesses of unregulated capitalism, at no point does BioShock try to present its world as normal. The events happening in the game are exceptional, and more importantly, the game treats them as exceptional. You are led through Rapture in a specific, deliberate manner in which to tell the narrative in a specific, deliberate way. When something shocking happens, the game tends to draw your attention to it. There's a cohesion between its level design and narrative that I believe, even on a subconscious level, assures the player that they are seeing the game world in a way that its designers intended. You're seeing a bunch of crazy stuff, and the game is asking you to do a bunch of crazy stuff. While the game does produce a sort of terror and dread in the player, it is a distinctly different type of dread from hypernormalization because the game's mechanics synergize with its narrative. In Umurangi Generation, the game wants you to sort of listlessly peruse its environment. The actual bounties it gives you almost never have anything to do with the UN's occupation, the corporate propaganda, or the kaiju. There's a dissonance between what the game is asking you to do and what you're actually seeing. 15 minutes after witnessing your first kaiju attack, you're being asked to photograph 3 ferns and a bench while your friends dance in the background. A nice little chime plays as you snap a photo of 5 American flags while a bloodied UN soldier looms just off frame. A level that features a horrific, apocalypse-inducing fight between Evangelion mechs and kaiju ends with a happy little jingle because you unlocked a new lens and post-production effect. I'm about to be that guy, but Umurangi Generation is a game aware of ludonarrative dissonance and is using that dissonance to make a point. So when I'm asked to photograph a mountain and just so happen to notice a UN seawall, I get that same feeling as the Skyrim glitch. I feel like I'm seeing something the game itself doesn't want me to see. Of course, I logically know that's not true. It's a game design hat trick, and a rather magnificent one, but the feeling is unsettling nevertheless. It also gives you this strange feeling of ownership over the game's narrative. You're not relying on the game to show you something, you're relying on yourself and your own ability to put the pieces together. The game doesn't outright show the UN's occupation erasing the Maori people's culture. Instead, we see that battle play out in the symbolic difference between official messaging from corporations and governments and the graffiti made in response to those images. The game doesn't outright tell us the Australian government stopped caring about the people killed by the Kaiju. Instead, we're presented with the contrasting images of an official monument to the lives lost in the first wave and then a contemporary graffiti painting honoring a recently killed mech pilot. The game doesn't feature some fictional president making a speech about how the Kaiju aren't a problem. Instead, we're presented with images and propaganda that normalize their presence in a much more subliminal, indirect manner. Even the connection between the Kaiju and the jellyfish, the thing I'd argue is the point of the game, is completely missable. You aren't required to take a photo of this Kaiju, and if you don't, you'd never explicitly know that the two were connected. This design choice runs the risk of going over some players' heads, which more on that in a bit. But because the game isn't leading you down that path with a heavy hand, it makes it all the more unsettling when you manage to put the pieces together on your own. Ultimately, isn't that closer to how we experience the world anyway? We're still not at the point where even the most callous politicians and CEOs will outright admit that they care more about corporate interests than human life. Well, for the most part. But their actions tell a different story, because their priority, above all else, is to make everything feel normal. So like I mentioned before, the subtle way in which Umurangi Generation delivers its narrative is powerful and evocative, but can also run the risk of its larger political and social themes completely going over some people's heads, something Faulkner himself has complained about. In some ways, it's almost too successful at recreating capitalist realism, to the point where if you're the kind of person who doesn't notice it in real life, you might not notice it in the game either. Because of that, I think the game potentially ran the risk of the wrong message being taken. I think some people may look at the casualness of the game's characters and mistake that for indifference, when it's really the end result of an entire socio-political apparatus that is unable to solve the problems it creates. The Kaiju apocalypse and the reaction to it was not an accident. I'm assuming that addressing those misconceptions and pushing on the game's political messaging was something that Faulkner was thinking about when he began conceptualizing the game's DLC. And then 5 days after Umurangi Generation came out, something happened that made pushing that political messaging in a more explicit way unavoidable. George Floyd was murdered by the police. Umurangi Generation's DLC is more explicit, harsher, and angrier than anything in the preceding 8 levels. As Errant Signal put it in his review of the game, the DLC, titled Macro, is essentially the video game equivalent of saying it louder for the people in the back. By the way, you should watch his video, it's better than this one. The overlaying theme in Macro, in my reading, is about how you don't get to the false sense of normalcy of the base game's world by accident. Indifference is not a spontaneous mindset coincidentally developed by a bunch of different people at the same time. It's a result of systems. If one high schooler lacks basic reading comprehension skills, that's an individual problem. If a third of them do, that points to a structural failing somewhere in our institutions. Likewise, mass cultural and social indifference to problems that sometimes affect you directly can't just be individuals independently arriving at that indifference on their own. If there are mass media campaigns, government restrictions on education, and corporate obfuscation that all lead people to think a certain way, maybe it's not a coincidence that a bunch of people think a certain way. Macro is a prequel taking place 2 weeks before the start of the original Umurangi Generation. Its 4 levels cover distinct ways in which the facade of capitalist realism is not just maintained through atmosphere alone, but also willful misdirection, marginalization, and force. The DLC feels much more pressing than the base game. Its parallels to the real world much less abstracted. It's an effective way to deliver its message for perhaps more stubborn players. If Umurangi Generation's Kaiju apocalypse felt too heightened, too different from the real world to get its point across in a believable manner for you, that's what the DLC is for. Macro grounds the player in a world much closer to our own, while also serving as connective tissue for the political circumstances that made the Kaiju apocalypse inevitable. Gamer's Palace, Macro's first level, takes place in a bougie arcade where wealthy dudes in suits pay to hang out with hot bunny girls and virtual anime waifus while PragerU plays in the background. Meanwhile, Taranga is in an active lockdown because of a kaiju attack. I think this level is ultimately about how consumerism is used as a tool of pacification. In a more overt sense, it's literally a distraction from what's actually happening. The arcade's tagline even reads, "Forget your worries, play all night." You can also step outside to find your friends just waiting, unable to afford to get into the club. The ultra wealthy can pay not only to forget about their problems, but to physically separate themselves from the repercussions of the problems that they usually had a hand in creating. This is, in part, how these things get to the point of disaster. The ultra rich, the ones who have the most political power under capitalism to effect change, don't feel the same pressing urgency as the rest of us because they view themselves as wholly separate beings from the rest of us, in part because they can afford to insulate themselves from disaster. But Gamer's Palace also tackles the idea of pacification via consumerism in a much less direct manner. Tucked in the back of the arcade is a little gift shop featuring Topsider, a luxury streetwear brand. Created by Anti-Establishment Clothing Company, the generic cyberpunk-looking brand is accompanied by various aesthetically revolutionary images. Brands, advertising, and media have co-opted revolutionary and anti-establishment imagery since forever, divorcing them from their larger political context. Things like punk rock and hip hop have been run through the strainer of mass culture, separating their overtly political origins from their aesthetics. When these cultural objects are reduced to their aesthetics, they are defanged as political tools. Instead of standing against the establishment, these cultural objects end up reinforcing it, almost always turning against the actual subversives that the culture originated from. In Umurangi Generation, the only genuine anti-establishment imagery comes from the graffiti painted by the Maori across the game's various locations. And amongst all the simulacra of revolution in the clothing display is this sign. Macro's second level takes place in an actual UN bunker. What we see here is how the UN projects a false image of superiority over the kaiju to the general public by both denying the humanity of the public and its own soldiers. Go down in history as someone who did something, rather than someone who complains all the time. Afraid to die? Don't be a pussy. Harden up. Kill confirmed. Us 1, them 0. Look, all of this is a little silly and over the top, but it's not that far off from the actual psychological manipulation used by militaries to get soldiers to do things they would normally find morally reprehensible. The problem with Umurangi Generation's UN army isn't that it just so happens to be made up of people who are more concerned about projecting an image of power than actually protecting people, but rather that the entire institution operates within a framework that stomps out that kind of moral consciousness. I mean, take a look at this poster where they're literally asking UN soldiers to lie and tell people that they're winning. And it is a lie. Not just because we know how the game actually ends, but because the UN itself is willfully deceitful. In the back of the bunker, past a long hallway full of names of presumably dead UN soldiers, is a chamber containing a destroyed UN Peace Sentinel, the same mechs we saw deployed at the end of the base game. The Sentinel was completely wrecked after a battle with a kaiju, its deceased pilots tossed into body bags like discarded trash. If there's any doubt, any plausible deniability that the government and the UN's deceit is anything but willful, purposeful manipulation designed to pacify the people, that dies here. The UN is losing, they know they're losing, and they're lying anyway. Geez, I wonder what the game could be saying here. The Depths, Macro's third level, takes place in a retrofitted sewer that homes the remnants of a genuine resistance movement to the UN's occupation. This is the base of operation for the rats, but more than that, it has become a de facto shelter for those left forgotten in the takeover of Taranga. Now, one very important thing about Umurangi Generation that I haven't really touched on much in this video is that the game is as much about colonialism as it is about capitalism. The UN's occupation of Taranga also serves as a stepping stone for corporations to come in and wipe out the remnants of Maori culture. The UN has been capturing quote-unquote anti-UN terrorists, some of whom are literal children, and seeing as the game equates anti-UN sentiment with graffiti, and the only graffiti comes from the Maori, yeah, we can put together the pieces of what's actually going on here. The Maori have been pushed out of their homeland and forced into places like this. It's another way to create a homogenous, ideologically rigid culture. The Maori, by their very existence, are a de facto resistance to the hyper-capitalist takeover of Taranga, and therefore cannot exist within the structure created by the UN's occupation. Their existence is an affront to the idea that any of this is normal. Then we get to the game's last level, Underground City, and here's where all of Umurangi Generation's ideas about neoliberalism, colonialism, and capitalist realism culminate in a cohesive thematic climax. The level takes place during an anti-UN protest. Graffiti covers the walls and floors with some of the most explicitly political statements I've ever seen in a video game, and for the first and only time, one of the game's core mechanical rules changes. Instead of having to avoid taking photos of the jellyfish, you have to avoid taking photos of the protesters' faces. To me, this implies that for the first time in the entire game, you're actually acting on your own behalf. You're no longer photographing for a soulless day job, but to send a political message. This plays out in the bounties you have to collect for this level too. For the first time, you're not being asked to photograph around the disaster, but to confront it directly. The game asks you to take photos of things like Molotov cocktails, tear gas containers, and flags with explicitly anti-UN messaging. It's a beautiful counter melody to the song that is the rest of Umurangi Generation. For the first and only time, the actual game is not asking you to look away. I think this level also shows something that is super important to what I believe the point of the DLC is. The titular Umurangi Generation, the last generation to watch the world die, did not watch in complete passivity. It may be easy to mistake the young people's chill vibes in the base game as indifference, but here we have definitive proof that that's not the case. But other than that main gameplay change, Underground City plays mostly the same as any other level in Umurangi Generation, until you finish the bounty. Normally, you're asked to finish your delivery by finding this red square after you take your last photo. This time, you're asked to gather near an ominous American flag wielding statue, at which point the city will shut down and a UN peace sentinel will emerge from the tunnels below. But there are no Kaiju here. The Peace Sentinel lurches over the protesters and locks eyes directly on you. The UN's real priorities are laid bare. 2 weeks out from the literal end of the world at the hands of a kaiju, they're unleashing a billion-dollar machine designed for a very specific threat on a group of teenagers with flags and stop signs. At this point, armed UN soldiers have infiltrated the protest, hitting them with a barrage of smoke bombs and rubber bullets. You can try to run, but eventually one of those soldiers will catch up to you. Finally, you, a photographer for a minor local media outlet who have spent the entire game taking innocuous photos, who, even under the most liberal definitions, did not participate in any kind of violence, gets a UN baton to the face, knocking you out cold. It's not a coincidence that the first and only time your character acts on their own political beliefs, they get the full force of the state knocked straight into their head. You and your friend's seeming indifference in the base game was not brought about by psychological manipulation, but physical intimidation. Because the forces that want to hide the cause of the kaiju invasion can never pacify everyone through propaganda and media manipulation alone. There will always be some that see through the half-truths and misdirection. But there's an answer for those people too. The last thing the game shows you is the massive cost the UN have racked up trying to protect Tauranga. And notably, it's revealed that at this point in the story, the UN had only used the Peace Sentinels twice. The one that we saw destroyed in the bunker, and the one at the protest. To the UN, the threat of the anti-UN protest was equal to the threat of the Kaiju. The Umurangi generation did try to fight back in the face of their own destruction. Instead of being met with resistance from the Kaiju, they were met with resistance from the state-backed military apparatus that was, ostensibly, there to protect them. After that, and with only weeks to go before the end of the world, why do anything but dance? Why do anything but pretend everything is normal? As I write this, the sky outside my own window is tinged with crimson from Canadian wildfires that, like the ones in 2020, are being presented by media and my government separate from the political context in which they exist. It's really hard to play Umurangi Generation and not see the themes and ideas it touches on reflected in many aspects of my own life. As the problems stemmed from late-stage unregulated capitalism become more and more obvious, the dissonance between the internal dread and the simulacra of normalcy makes me feel like I'm also sitting on that rooftop in a dying Tauranga. Because of all that, I think Umurangi Generation will gradually gain the reputation of being prophetic, but I believe that term is incorrect when applied to this game. To be prophetic implies some kind of intervention by supernatural means and almost spiritual insight into the future whose connection to the present is serendipitous. That's not the future that Umurangi Generation warns us about. There's nothing accidental about how it depicts the end of the world. All Umurangi Generation is giving us is an honest reflection of ourselves. It sees the mundanity of these seemingly innocuous symbols and shows us the logical repercussions of the indifference they create. It's not a prophecy, it's a warning, because everything is not normal.